24. Board members may attend and participate in board meetings by electronic means in accordance with BVSD policy MEA and state law. Laura, can you please call the roll?
Chavez.
Here.
Medler.
Here.
Niznik.
Here.
Quinlan Oeda. Rajpal.
Here.
Sargent.
Here.
Unger.
Here.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to turn it over to Jorge Chavez, who will be reading our land acknowledgement this morning.
Reconocimiento de la tierra. El Distrito Escolar del Valle de Boulder reside y opera en tierras que son tierras ancestrales natales e injusta y ilegalmente arrebatadas del territorio de los pueblos Ute, Puebloan, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Apache, Navajo y otras 48 naciones tribales históricamente asociadas a estas tierras, y que han llamado a estas tierras como su hogar desde tiempos inmemoriales. Reconocemos las atrocidades realizadas aquí, incluyendo la dolorosa historia de genocidio, la asimilación forzada y los esfuerzos para alienar a los habitantes indígenas de sus tierras, con el apoyo de las políticas del gobierno de los Estados Unidos. El BVSD es consciente de los muchos pueblos indígenas, en el pasado y en el presente, y sus naciones y culturas dignas que cuidan la tierra con fuerza y resistencia. El BVSD reconoce las historias de la tierra en Colorado y la supervivencia de las muchas naciones que han llevado sus tradiciones orales hasta el presente. Es la responsabilidad del BVSD de educarnos a nuestras comunidades y a nuestros estudiantes para que podamos celebrar y respetar la sabiduría y el conocimiento de los pueblos indígenas y unirnos activamente para abordar las injusticias. Al ofrecer este reconocimiento de la tierra, afirmamos y honramos la historia, la sabiduría y las tradiciones orales y resiliencia de los pueblos indígenas, y reconocemos la responsabilidad de cuidar y apreciar esta tierra juntos.
Thank you, Jorge. I'd like to remind everyone that the mission of the Boulder Valley School District is to create challenging, meaningful, and engaging learning opportunities so that all children thrive and are prepared for successful, civically engaged lives. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. At this time, is there a motion to approve this morning's agenda? Moved by Jason, seconded by Beth. Laura, can you please call the roll?
Chavez.
Yes.
Medler.
Yes.
Niznik.
Yes.
Quinlan Oeda. Yes. Rajpal.
Yes.
Sargent.
Yes.
Unger.
Yes.
Motion passes.
This morning, we have one item on our agenda, which is a work session discussing BVSD's strategic plan and UIP. I will turn it over to Dr. De La Cruz or Dr. Anderson to do the introductions.
Thank you, Board President Rajpal, board members. Welcome, everyone, to our third in a series of daytime work sessions where we take deep dives into information pertinent to our district. Last time we met, we spoke a lot about declining enrollment and dug into that a little bit. And this will be our second session related to strategic plan. And so very excited to be able to present to you all today. Format will be very similar to the last time that we've met. There's a little voice and choice in the presentation as I'll turn it over here to Dr. De La Cruz in a moment, but want to set the stage for what our team is hoping that we all can accomplish this morning. First, we have new information to share. Since the last time we did this, and I believe it was August 20th, we've had new information, more granular information, and so we want to take the opportunity to share that information regarding some of our subgroups. Some of the information that we've said is really great. Some are potential challenges, and we'll dig into some of those in a little bit in detail, hopefully really establishing the rhythm of when we have data that we need to learn more about, what do we do? And so we'll do that a little bit. We have updates on our strategic plan progress that's also in alignment with the superintendent goals that you all have recently passed around strategic leadership, instructional, and achievement leadership. And then we're going to make sure that we have lots of time for questions, feedback as we go along. But I'd ask board members, I'd ask you to think about two big questions to consider for today. As we think about how we leverage these sessions to get better as a school district, when we share with you, and we're going to have some new data looks, some based on the feedback that you provided up for us so well in August, some on some new data looks. Number one, what do you draw from this data? Right, so I'd ask you to either write that down or just keep that top of mind when we're showing you looks at data. And then the second question is, so what, then what? Which is actually two questions, but I mushed them together into one. Based on this information, what do you do with it, right? It's wonderful to deep dive into data and know and understand and be transparent with our public on what's happening. But I think for us, because this is really about improvement and strategic plan, that we want the data to be a means to an end, to either answer a problem or to dig in deeper to an issue, to direct next steps. Actionable data is critical in terms of school and district improvement. So hopefully that sets the stage for today. I'm excited to turn it over. We've got our amazing team here again with us. We have Laura, Jonathan, Claire, and Chris, Kathleen, Laura, and I here to support and walk us through. We have 2 hours and 53 minutes, something like that. We've got 53 slides that we're going to dig into. I believe it's 53. I'm looking at Laura to verify, but it's a lot. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. De La Cruz.
Good morning, President Rajpal, members of the board. As Dr. Anderson said, back in August, we spent time with you all discussing the frame and direction for the strategic plan and the UIP, along with strategic objectives and leading measures and dashboards that were being built. You provided really thoughtful discussion, feedback, and input, and we appreciate that. We've built that into what we'll be sharing today. And as Dr. Anderson said, Jonathan, Chris, Claire, and I have updates and discussion points. We've built in reflection opportunities as well, and we look forward to your continued feedback and input. And so let's go to slide 2. We have built in choice and voice for you today, so really you're driving. You can let us know where you'd like to go first. We have a lot to share with you around the work of the strategic support teams, the implementation strategies of the strategic plan and the UIP, with more details about implementation, as well as some comparative data with student groups and the data dashboard development. So we'll pause here for you to let us know where you'd like to go first.
Or we can just drive. If that's the consensus, we'll just drive, okay.
If you feel like there's a logical rhythm, I think without anybody jumping on right away, maybe that's just the best course.
Great. I do think that we're in sequence for a logical view. So after your input on August 20th, our team worked to put those finishing touches on the Altogether for All Students strategic plan, the 4 strategic objectives, the implementation measures in the UIP. And you can see kind of the refined version here, looking at the 4 headlines of no limits, next best step, define the destination and valued and included. Really looking deeply at ensuring that every student has access to grade level standards and instruction, that we're providing tiered supports, we've got a clear pathway to post-secondary preparation for students, and that we are centering our work in student well-being and cultural competency.
Good morning, board members. Thank you for having us. So as a follow-up to our last meeting, wanted to be able to present to you the strategic plan implementation strategies in alignment with our district UIP in this quadrant format that you'll be seeing, so that we can also relate this back to the metrics that we're going to be showing you here in a little bit as well. So first, under grade level standards and instruction are no limits. These implementation measures are going to be increasing the percentage of classrooms where we're seeing a depth of knowledge 3 or 4 around demonstrated skill or understanding of a completed task. So this is something that over the next 2 years, we're going to be engaging in professional learning around, and then also being able to gauge how well that's being implemented throughout our system. Additionally, we'll have 10 hours of embedded professional learning around standards, culturally relevant pedagogy, and cultural competency. Yeah.
Just to unpack number 1 for you, so that makes sense. So I think one of the things that we see, one of the challenges, one of the big challenges in public education, private education too, I would imagine, is that when you have standards that the standards aren't taught to the level of complexity that they're intended, right? In educationese, you'll hear people say unpacking the standards. Maybe you've heard that term, you'll hear this term, depth of knowledge. And the depth of knowledge really is, to what extent are we asking kids to analyze, synthesize, and evaluate information versus just recall information, right? So you could have the same topic, and this happens in state standards, that might be the same topic 4th through 8th grade, but every year we ask kids to know and understand a little bit deeper. And so as we think about how do we know that kids are getting access to rigorous, challenging, engaging work in their classes that's aligned to standards, that's why we've said that we'll go into classrooms and collect student work and analyze that as a measure. So as a little bit, we hadn't talked a lot about that. I just wanted to kind of provide some context there.
Could someone define the levels for me? And is there, this is a different version of the deck than what's posted, is there, I'm not up to date.
So when we get to this UIP implementation measure slide, I will be sharing more detail
Okay.
around depth of knowledge. And I think this looks different than the way the deck did, because the deck in a PDF didn't animate this way.
What percentage of classrooms are we currently auditing? What kind of increase are we looking at?
So right now, this is a part of our 2-year UIP strategy. This first year is focused on depth of learning, professional learning for principals, so that they can understand what it is that they'll be looking for, that they can collaboratively look at those tasks and dive deeper into each of the levels of depth of knowledge, building their capacity first before we go in and audit into the actual classrooms.
And just so we know, this slide is an overview of what we're going to spend time diving more deeply into in the subsequent slides.
Yep. So in following with the Jeopardy theme here, we'll push those into those different quadrants for you, but tiered supports. So 100% of non-charter schools successfully documenting evidence of MTSS with artifacts. Accuracy of intervention records increased over the baseline, and 100% of non-charter schools will reach core level of district DDI rubric. So again, we'll talk in more depth around each of these things. Post-secondary preparation, 3 or more paths published on the district website of secondary course registration materials, so in alignment with the recommendations that we have received around CTE coursework. 100% of non-charter schools serving grades PK will offer 1 or more career exploration opportunity. And then finally, well-being and cultural competency. So this is the accuracy of discipline resolutions per student actions relative to baseline, supporting equity goals in all of our schools, and then again, ongoing professional learning around standards, culturally relevant pedagogy, and cultural competency. So let's dive into those implementation strategies. And if it's okay, board members, I think the flow of this would go that I would give us a brief overview of the 5-year strategies, the high impact strategies we see as a part of the strategic plan. And then Laura will go into a little bit more depth on current state as well as progress being made towards those specific UIP goals that we've outlined already. That's okay. So 5-year high impact strategies. So we've talked about professional learning. We are engaging in a professional learning series with our new Director of Equity and Inclusive Teaching and Learning, Floretta King, who's amazing. And so that's being held with principals. We're also embedding cultural competency in all district-directed professional learning with teachers. We talked at length around the importance of data-driven instruction, the progress being made on that. We're going to continue that support. We're supporting that through our differentiated funding and the different supports that schools can choose to purchase and supporting the coaching around DDI, through our strategic support teams as well as district DDI leads. And then this commitment to collecting artifacts of implementation within that DDI rubric. So how are we identifying where schools are within their implementation? Creating a heat map, if you will, of how we can provide targeted supports with the limited resources that we have available to us, and ensuring that all schools are making progress in their current work around DDI. And focused observation and feedback. So this is where we talked about the ability to provide high quality professional learning to leaders first around depth of knowledge. so that they understand what it is that they're looking for, that we can analyze tasks together, that they can calibrate with their colleagues as they're looking through specific tasks and specific content areas. This is building up their knowledge so that they feel very comfortable as we walk in and we say, hey, we want to better understand where we are within the levels of depth of knowledge, whether that be in a task or in the questioning that's happening in the classroom. All of those things are going to be covered as a part of that professional learning and calibration that they'll be able to have. And when we say system calibration and support for common goals, right now that common goal is around Standard 1, Element A of the teacher rubric. So again, that's going to be all focused around grade level standards. And there's, I believe, 8 professional practices within that standard. We've presented that at a couple of different professional learnings already, but we're going to continue to dive into what that looks like. What are the guiding questions when we think about educator effectiveness within that standard? What are the things that we can all, every principal around the system, every teacher around the system, what are the guiding questions that we're going to be asking and reflecting on when we walk through classrooms? Keeping the main thing around standards. That's a great way for us to be able to elevate that through our goals.
Now diving into the connected UIP implementation measures directly related to that strategic objective. We're looking to ensure grade level standards in instruction, and we talked a little bit about depth of knowledge. We'll talk more about it now. So as we aim to increase the percentage of classrooms where student assignments predominantly require a depth of knowledge 3 or 4 in demonstration of skills, not only in addition to what Dr. Anderson shared about depth of knowledge, not only that, we're also thinking about when we had our strategic plan recommendation from the review, and when Shelley Billig was before the board and talked about how a first level of understanding standards, even before unpacking them, is for our system to understand depth of knowledge that the standards require to really get to the rigor of the standards. And that's one reason why we're spending time calibrating across our system around depth of knowledge. We're in year 1 right now, which is learning with our leaders and spending time at our elementary, middle, and high school meetings, as well as our PK-12 meetings, learning about the complexity, the depth, and the rigor of the standards through Webb's depth of knowledge. And if it would be helpful, we'd be happy to share more about that framework with the board.
Yes.
So we can do that in a couple of ways. I will talk about it a bit today, but we can also share through news and notes or another venue, whatever would be helpful.
I'm going to have Laura print out a copy of the
Okay.
depth of knowledge wheel so
Great.
you can see what we're talking about.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
and
and
I'll just pull it
it's
up.
also projected right now. So depth of knowledge really takes the task from what you see here as DOK 1 up to DOK 4. So DOK, depth of knowledge 1 being kind of that basic recall and reproduce. And you can see what that looks like here, the who, what, where, when. Depth of knowledge 2, looking at applying knowledge and skills through basic reasoning. Depth of knowledge 3 is heading toward more critical thinking, strategic thinking, how we can make use of what we're learning, and understanding what the problem is and how to solve it, really more of that critical thinking. And then depth of knowledge 4 is the extensive thinking to think creatively and transfer knowledge across content areas. So that's really getting to that greatest depth of the standard. And as Chris indicated earlier, as we're working with our leaders, who are of course in classrooms through observation feedback and whether formal or informal, and in coaching cycles, the use of depth of knowledge and the framework allows our leaders to really calibrate around that deeper, more rigorous use of and learning around the standard, and also around our common goal to elevate and amplify our work in the teaching standard 1, element A of grade level standards. So we can pause here for questions, for reflection. I don't know if we want to, you can let us know if you'd like to keep it here or move to a slide that we've just been to.
I don't know who calls on me.
President
May I just
Rochpaul.
jump in? So this is my first brush with Webb's depth of knowledge. So I was just kind of wanting to linger on it a little bit longer for my own understanding. So one of the questions that springs to my mind first is, what's the response been with our leadership, our principals, around the professional development with depth of knowledge? Are they finding it helpful, useful, overwhelmed? I mean, what has that been? And then maybe a follow-up question to that. what are the implications between this framework and principal observation of staff and feedback? I'm assuming those two things partner pretty well.
And can you go back to the slide that, because we didn't quite get to the next professional development piece for this, and that will connect to the question that Beth is asking. Thank you. So if you take a look at the second part of our implementation measures, we are building depth of knowledge into the work that we're doing with our leaders first. And that really, we took the first deep dive in our October PK-12 meeting. And the response has been, we have a spectrum of folks who've been exposed to this, to some who this is their first time learning and understanding it. I think many people are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, which is not dissimilar to Webb's depth of knowledge. This is a simplified framework. And I would say that there's been an intrigue and an interest in what this means for what we're seeing in classrooms, how it connects to this grade level standards that we expect to see in classrooms, and the metacognition around, for our leaders, around like, how does this play out in my coaching conversations and observation and feedback with teachers, and what will be the implications of that even in the evaluation conversations. So I would say there's a continuum of understanding, and it's really, we're building it in fairly naturally to the work we're doing around depth and rigor of the standard. And you can also see here that, just since we're here, in terms of professional learning around standards, culturally relevant pedagogy, cultural competency, we have contractually 10 hours that we can guarantee of district-directed time with our teachers. And then we also have our late start, but that's less, we have district-directed late start time once a month, and late start essentially is the equivalent of about 45 minutes once everyone has gotten settled in. But we are connecting a depth of knowledge and cultural competency to our work with curriculum, standards, and the business of teaching and learning. And you can see the dates here when we have been able to incorporate those. When we come to have a next conversation with you, we'll have more dates connected to that. But essentially, that's where we have been able to infuse this work so far.
Jason?
Yeah, thanks. I guess similar to Beth, it's kind of the first time I've worked with this term. Do you feel like it lines up nicely or evenly with state standards, or does this require like a full kind of reteaching of state standards and how they look through this template or this framework?
That's a great question. I do not believe it requires a reteaching of, but rather a more critical thinking lens on teaching and learning, so that we're moving toward greater complexity in not only the content that we deliver, but how we deliver it, and the opportunities that we provide students to engage in the content with each other and to show what they know, demonstrate learning. So it really is about moving ourselves as the educators from that more foundational delivery, conversation engagement to more of a like a problem-based learning, more real-world learning, and more authentic opportunities to engage with through a critical thinking lens.
I guess just on that, is this being kind of framed as through these professional development sessions as just another way to look at the standards, or is this like, I think, we always hear about, if you don't like a program, just wait it out because the next program will be there. Like, is this, I think that's the concern, is that, is this like being viewed as another new thing, or is this being viewed as just another way to look at what we've already been teaching and working with for the last X number of years?
So Webb's depth of knowledge is certainly not new. Now, it may be new to some folks within our school district and some leaders who haven't had exposure. I mean, I remember having in-depth training on this as a principal in 2009, 2010. I think the approach that we're taking, just so you can understand what we're doing, is maybe different than others. In other places, what they'll try to do is tons and tons of teacher hop-in, drop-in observations, and we're going to do some of those, right? But when we measure this, what we're asking our teachers is, what are you having the kids do? right? And so the way that, the reason we're using Webb's depth of knowledge as the tool to analyze what kids do is it's pretty easy to understand and self-explanatory. We have, Laura's going to get copies of the wheel that we use that has examples of level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 activities. Because as you think about our kids who aren't growing to standard, the worst thing that can happen is teachers are teaching what they're intending on teaching, and kids are learning that, but they're not growing at the levels that they need to being able to achieve at an above grade level. And so they may be unintentionally teaching under the standards. So I do think that there's a learning curve anytime you do something new, and I think that, to Laura's point, that some folks get it, they're like, why haven't we been doing this? And other folks are like, what's this, right? And it's an extension on Bloom's taxonomy, right, which was when I was in College of Ed, that's kind of what we used to know and understand how challenging do you make something as a task or as a lesson, knowing and understanding, when you get to that, the higher end of Bloom's analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, when you're asking kids to evaluate each other's work, when you're asking kids to take different sources, primary sources, and synthesize them together and come up with conclusions, when you're asking, those types of things cognitively challenge you differently, right? And if we're just focusing standards on the topics to cover, right, then you don't necessarily get to the depth of challenge that kids need to be pushed so they learn and grow at or above grade level. So we could talk a lot about this. It's really interesting. I'm very into it, as you could probably tell, because I do think it's a difference maker, and it's something that can make great teachers even better by knowing that and understanding that and thinking about instruction and what you're asking kids to do in those ways, right? And it's from write your vocabulary words 5 times to take these 5 vocabulary words, bring those together, and what's a synonym that would surmise maybe these 5 vocabulary words, right, through a synthesis and evaluation. So I'm happy to continue to talk about this, but I do want to be wary of time.
And one last thing I would add to that is that so far our approach has been, this is a tool, it's a resource. Teachers, it's a resource and a tool if you'd like to explore this and incorporate it into what you're already doing, to expand what you're doing. And for our leaders, which is our first level of learning in this year 1, we are also sharing it as a tool and a resource, but also building it explicitly into how we look at our standards.
Noting that our PD is only as good as the people that show up to it, I guess, how is it being received by teachers, or do we have any information yet? And then the other question is, when we're sort of mashing up culturally relevant pedagogy and content with the sort of standards-based level discussion, like what's the ratio of one versus the other, or are they all just totally synthesized together?
Could you repeat the second part of your
So
question?
we're sort of combining the professional learning around the standards and culturally relevant pedagogy and cultural competency, according to the slide. So how much of the work that we're doing with teachers this year will get to this stuff on the levels of the Webb's system, and how much will be focused on the culturally relevant pedagogy and content?
So your first question was, professional development is only as effective as those who attend. We agree. And for those who attended, for instance, yesterday, the feedback around the work that we did yesterday around building in cultural competency, grade level, engaging, affirming meaningful practices, cultural competency, which combines grade level standards. Very positive. And we've really been anchoring to the work of Zaretta Hammond around cultural competency and culturally relevant pedagogy, and as well as the work of Lacey Robinson in a book called Justice Seekers, which really focuses on equity being found in the details of teaching and learning. And so we are leaning into an educator's ability to recognize the strengths and assets that students bring to the classroom and help to meaning make and respond in culturally relevant and positive ways that are constructive for the students in front of us. And that has been a very, there's been a positive response to that. And so in terms of bringing all of these elements together, We are, as I said, anchoring to the reality that social justice and equity is found in the classroom in the details of teaching and learning, because we strongly agree with the tenant that these are interconnected. It's not one or the other. We talked last time we were together about how isolated professional learning around equity, while a wonderful experience for many, hasn't necessarily changed practices in classrooms. And so we're working to strengthen the understanding of the interconnectedness. And as I said, so far, the response has been positive, and there's been appreciation around the fact that we're acknowledging that every single thing that happens in the classroom needs to happen through a lens of cultural competency, and that we're building learning in that way. And as Chris said earlier, Floretta King led some professional development yesterday, which we'll talk more about, that was widely positively received as well.
Okay, so our 5-year high-impact strategies for tiered supports. When we think about MTSS, I know we had some extensive conversation around this the last time that we met. The high-impact strategy is really unpacking MTSS, identifying where the gaps are within that system, and then coming around schools to make sure that we're supporting high-quality implementation of MTSS. So going through that gap analysis, you may remember that schools all participated in a self-reflection of where they are within MTSS based on an MTSS implementation guide that reflected that of CDE in the state. And we're engaging in ongoing professional learning with building leaders around what high-quality implementation of MTSS looks like. And then in addition to that, we're also going to be going through evidence collection of key artifacts within a high-quality MTSS system, so that we can also be looking at what those key components are in each building. We can calibrate amongst those, and we can provide the necessary supports for schools as they try to move along that spectrum of implementation with MTSS. So a lot of traction around that being one of the biggest strategies for us. Intervention, the evaluation of intervention documentation is something we're going to talk a little bit more about as we dive into the data. So we'll learn more about how we're looking at that documentation and how we're going to make some key decisions on strategies around intervention. So that'll be a focus as well. And then, as I said before, the ongoing support of data-driven instruction through differentiated funding supports, as well as our strategic plan support teams and district DDI leads. And then just like with MTSS, as a part of MTSS's DDI, we're going to be collecting artifacts and evidence around DDI as well, so that we can be supportive to schools.
And just pulling on that thread a bit to look at the more nuanced implementation measures in connecting to the UIP and those leading indicators that we are focused on. We set goals around MTSS intervention and data-driven instruction. So first and foremost, first, we are focused on the successful documentation of evidence of MTSS in all areas with artifacts. MTSS is so big, it's immense. It's everything we do in school. It's all of school in MTSS. And so we know that we've got to chunk it down in order to have measurable implementation and leading indicators. And so our principals are spending time in professional development continuously around MTSS and have completed an MTSS self-reflection with input and collaboration from executive directors and MTSS team members, and are establishing improvement goals around that based on that baseline landing place. In terms of interventions, we really want to ensure that we're recording interventions accurately, and we want to set a baseline for that and then increase accuracy by 5% over the baseline. So we plan to have that baseline development by January or mid-year, which gives the system time to level set and to begin auditing. We also have a goal around 100% of our non-charter schools reaching the core level on the DDI rubric. Currently, 3 of our schools or 6%, are at that core level of implementation. 29 of our schools, or 57%, are at that foundational level, and 19 schools, or 37%, are at the starting level. Just an interesting note, we have We're going to be talking more with you about the 10 schools in our strategic plan support cohort 1 of schools. And of those schools, Creekside is the one school who is at the core level of implementation with DDI. And we'll talk more about that. It's an interesting note since we'll be talking more about the strategic plan support teamwork. This is a great time for reflection, discussion.
And I realize we have multiple different things, between UIP and strategic plan and everything else we do. If the tiered supports were working and the MTSS was in place, can we link it to what our observable student outcome questions? I mean, that's sort of one of the questions I have for a lot of these things is, let's say we were 5 years from now or 3 years from now and this was working, what would we see? How do we know this was working when we looked at the student outcomes?
It's an element of the overall big picture. MTSS, grade level standards, the right level of challenge. I mean, ultimately, you would hopefully see increased growth first, then increased achievement, right? From folks who haven't, from our subgroups, and we'll get into them. Not all of our subgroups are growing at the same rates or achieving at the same rates. You start to ultimately see that close. I mean, I think that's the hope and desire. But as we'll speak to, we have a complex strategy. It's not just we're going to do this one thing and it's going to fix all the things. So it's hard to, it's not a direct correlation, right? But, our hope would be that creates the conditions that would lead to increased growth and increased achievement. And, ultimately over time, if you do things like tiered supports as well, for some kids, they'll always need the tiered supports, and for other kids, they'll get to a place where their achievement is at a level where they won't need those, right? So, but I wouldn't want to say that you'd have less kids in MTSS and that would be a success. I think that's a dangerous metric to set, incentivizing folks to be moved away from that when they still might need it.
Thank you for this. I'm really enjoying the conversation and where you're going with this. And I really appreciate the look at kind of what we're doing with MTSS right, as a starting point to figure out gaps. You mentioned evaluation of intervention, documentation and processes, and for the documentation accuracy, you at 5%. But I'm curious about the processes, about what that's going to look like and to what degree you'll involve parents and students, especially from those who are likely to have difficult times going through the different processes as a part of that kind of evaluation of gaps and holes and kind of where we could be doing a better job. And I know that's coming in January 25, but if there's thoughts about where you're going with that.
I want to make sure I understand your question. Are you asking how we're involving families and guardians in the process?
In the evaluation process, in the evaluation of the,
process.
evaluation process of the processes for MTSS to figure
Got
out
it.
gaps.
Okay.
Yeah. Make sense?
That's a really good point. And it's, I definitely want our team to look at ways that we can be asking families and guardians, whether it's at the school level, whether it's in the actual process itself, or more of a meta level, so asking through a survey or some kind of feedback opportunity about their experience, their involvement, and even the clarity or understanding of the process and how we can improve it. That's an excellent point. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, because I know it's complex for us, and I know for parents even more so. So, thank you.
And that really creates a more robust understanding of how we are serving our system and/or where we can improve.
I would just add one just thought, and I'll think we will have arrived when it comes to MTSS. We can say with confidence and work and engage with our parent groups, these are the things that you can expect to happen at all of our schools, and if these don't happen, this is, right, so to the extent, the variability around how MTSS is being implemented or has been embraced, right, I think is one of our biggest challenges. And you could go back to what Shelley said, to what, we all know, right? And it's hard for parents because, if parents hear, oh, we're doing MTSS, then their experience is they're not experiencing MTSS, right? You got to get on the same page as the schools first, train your leaders, train your teachers, set the expectations, right? And then, to your point, if you were to ask parents, okay, your child is do you feel like they're receiving the services they need at MTSS? Here's what's supposed to look like. They could then give you feedback that also would help with the analysis and evaluation. I would just say that, where we are, a wide variability in understanding, knowledge, and execution on what's very complicated. And so I think that that's step one. And then ultimately, over time, your family's parents, you empower them to know what's happening, and then that can also help as part of the evaluation.
And to that point, our MTSS director and team have created a very comprehensive MTSS guide with every component very clearly spelled out. And because it is so vast and comprehensive, MTSS itself by its very nature, that is why we're breaking it down into smaller components so that we can support schools in wherever they are on the continuum in taking the next step, but also making sure that foundation is in place before the next step is taken. We want to get the direction right and then move forward.
Just kind of to that point, on the flip side of it, for those 19 schools that are in the starting category, can you give, I don't know the DDI rubric offhand, but can you give us some examples of what that might look like if you walked into those schools, like what you are seeing or what you're not seeing?
You want to speak to that, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So the DDI rubric is broken down by specific practices in categories within DDI, including the building culture around it, assessment practices that are taking place. So when we say starting, the way that we establish this rubric is similar to what you would see on a CDE teacher guide. We're basically saying that you're not going to be in foundational or core until you have all of these things checked. So it doesn't mean that there's not things that are happening. There are some core things that are happening in some of these buildings, but until we can categorize them as core, we want to see all of those boxes checked to make sure that they're foundational in that place and that they can build on it moving forward. So all of our schools are engaging. That's why it's starting in that. They're working through it. It's just there may be a checkbox or two that we feel like we need to lean in on more before we would put them into a foundational core or foundational category.
And just to be clear, that the schools that are in starting aren't doing anything wrong, right? That we have, these are schools where we haven't set the expectation yet that this is how we're going to move and proceed. As a reminder, right, we started by scaling with our high support schools, implement these practices over a number of years, saw great results, and then, the theory is that when we scale these moving forward, that's how we're going to continue to close gap, raise achievement. So I just want to be clear, right, for anybody who's watching, who's at a starting school, keep up the great work. There's nothing that you've done that isn't in line with expectations. I just think, large organizational change takes time and the right sequencing. And so, and to Chris's point, you'll see probably in those schools bright spots, and you'll see folks saying, I'm just getting started with this.
And I didn't mean that in a kind of negative tone. It was more, I guess the flip side of the question is, walking into those 3 core schools, what are you seeing that is like the ideal for all the schools? I think just practically, what does this look like if we talk about these 3 core schools without naming names? Like, what is the goal that we're looking for all our schools?
And actually, I know you shared the DDI rubric with the first look at the UIP. We're going to be approving the UIP next week, so it'd be a good chance to resend that DDI rubric out to board members so we can see all of those different levels and what those indicators are. Sorry to cut you off, Chris. I'll let you answer that question.
No, thank you. And we'll definitely get that back out to you. So if I understand the question, what's the ideal state within DDI? I do believe that ideal state is what we have listed within the core aspect of the DDI rubric. So obviously, we would love everybody to get to the deep aspect of it, but if you look at the practices of it, they're written in such a way that we can see progress along all of those schools. So, and thinking about culture, it's our staff able to clearly articulate the why behind DDI? Do we have assessments that are in place that are able to support the overall reteaching strategies within the system, right? So are they happening on frequency that aligns with the units and the modules that are taking place, and they're able to build in time in order to have a reteach and lift up those students who maybe had some unfinished learning within that. We want to be able to see evidence of those things. Evidence is what we would see in those artifacts. So when you get that DDI rubric again, I think taking a close look at what those artifacts are, that's what we're going to be looking at from an objective standpoint, as well as our executive directors are obviously in classrooms doing walks as well to make sure that they're seeing those things. But those artifacts would be things like a DDI calendar. We're making the time and the space for those things, and we can see that the structures are in place for all teachers to be engaging and growing in if students have unfinished learning, as well as if students need extension.
And quick question, board members, would it be helpful if we set up a visit to one of those core schools so you could see it? I mean, a lot of this is really theoretical, right? Like, and I don't want to lose people in the theory. Maybe if you just see it, you'll be able to feel it and understand it. And so we can take that back as a potential opportunity moving forward. You know, what does a core school look like?
Okay, post-secondary preparation. So career exploration is obviously an emphasis around this. So our Dare to Dream expansion to all elementary schools, ensuring that we have some career exploration opportunities in the elementary level. The implementation of Pathfinder, which is our new work-based learning and career interest platform. So providing toolkits in support of launching that new platform, again, with the emphasis of supporting all grade levels. And then a clear path of coursework for students based on career interest. So this is the establishment of work-based learning codes, which are new for this year. So we have specific courses that we can code students for. We can track them better. We know a lot of work-based learning was taking place in the system that we were unable to track. We're going to be able to do a better job of that. Developing the CTE pathways. So I referenced that we have recommendations for school pathways at the high school level. So being able to clearly articulate what those offerings are and how to work through those. And then our ongoing focus on advanced coursework. And this could include specific targets around specific students as well. What are we doing to make sure that we're lifting up all of our students into these advanced coursework opportunities, making sure that we are very transparent in what's available to them at what school so that they can pursue those career interests.
And the implementation measures we're tracking for this strategic objective include having those 3 or more pathways published on the A district website and referenced in secondary course registration materials. We're developing this year in conjunction with our bond work and with our CTE current state and expansion. We plan to have it published prior to the January 2026 registration period. I know that's a ways out because it involves so many key components, such as, the course registration materials, working with the CTE development and our bond work. But we will be bringing the board periodic updates between now and then. We are also focused on our non-charters who are serving PK through 8 students, offering 1 or more career exploration opportunities in this school year and beyond. And in terms of elementary, as Chris indicated, we're scaling out the Dare to Dream work slowly this year and more rapidly next year. So we're moving this year from 1 school having implemented Dare to Dream last year to having about a third of our elementary schools implementing it this year. So that's 12 schools with a rapid expansion next year for 100% of our elementary schools having Dare to Dream opportunities for students. And in our middle schools this year, we're having schools report out on career exploration activities and events that are provided with an expectation to continue expanding. We can pause here for questions and discussion. Beth?
Very exciting stuff. Thanks for sharing that. Just a quick question around the Dare to Dream kind of came to my mind. How are we getting folks from the community? What's our partnership look like with bringing folks in to participate in these Dare to Dream events? Maybe discuss that a little more and talk about what we're doing to I don't know, take advantage of our amazing community here in the Boulder Valley area.
Thanks for that question. So our Executive Director of Strategic Partnerships, Dr. Bianca Gallegos, and her team, including those who are within the Grad Plus team, are working with elementary schools who are scaling it out now. So they're essentially building a toolkit that can create more of a turnkey opportunity for schools who can then make it their own. And within that, the partnerships that are in place and that are needed, the folks on the Grad Plus team and Dr. Gallegos's other team members are reaching out to those partnerships. So not only current, but also potential partners. and then looking at school-specific potential partners who are either proximal or have a high interest in partnership or just make sense to elevate what's happening at the school, not only through Dare to Dream, but other career exploration opportunities. And so I would say that there's a multifaceted outreach happening. I wouldn't say that there is something tangible we can hand over right now because the toolkits are being built in conjunction with schools. And we can certainly provide more updates on that as they build.
Great, thank you.
So in conjunction with our Grad Plus framework and the career pathway and discovery stuff, when I was at the DAC meeting earlier this month talking about graduation requirements, a lot of lack of understanding around ICAP and any of that information that we have on our students' desire or, aspirations or aptitudes. And I wonder, as we're working through this, how we're continuing to share that out with parents, whether it's around career discovery or the pathways and how it aligns with individual students' aptitudes that are identified. That ICAP is information doesn't seem to be crossing from student and schools to the families to help in navigating some of these really new and exciting opportunities. And so I just wanted to put that out there. That it's a little bit of a Pandora's box for parents at this time.
You're absolutely right, President Rajpal. ICAP has been a mandate for a while, and I would say has been implemented unevenly across the state and across schools within our district as well as grade levels, and that's as we are contemplating graduation requirement changes, which we'll be bringing before the board for conversation soon. We're looking at what we need to do to revision ICAP to make it, to elevate it, to make it relevant, to connect it more clearly to students and their aspirations and to parents, families, and guardians. So you are right that this is an area for us to continue elevating, and we're recognizing the connection between that and our our graduation requirements. So we're in a revisioning of ICAP right now. I think that over time in school districts, because it was an unclear mandate that rolled out from the state kind of in that uneven way that it happened years ago, there's been a continuum of implementation across school districts, and we want to level set that for our community so that we have more clarity about ways that it supports interest-based and aspirations and opportunities for our students. We have work to do there.
I really appreciate the focus here on expanding advanced coursework across schools and thinking about, making sure that it's accessible in different ways across every school in the district. There was another component I thought in terms of where it exists, providing increased avenues for groups that have not been served by advanced coursework and providing better accessibility there. And I don't see that here. Is that a part of this? Is that separate? Where would that fit in?
That's a great point.
Yeah, that's, so not listed on there, but it is a part of our overall objectives, right? So within advanced coursework, I know that Dr. Gallegos and the entire Grad Plus team has the proportionality of advanced coursework in the top of all of their goals as a team. So yes, we want to increase advanced coursework opportunities for all of our students. And yes, we have targeted objectives within students to ensure proportionality within those as well.
And while you don't see that named here, some of the work that Dr. Gallegos and her team are doing includes very specific, detailed numbers of students, for instance, students of color, students who are experiencing poverty at each high school, and then what percentage of these students are participating in advanced coursework. And then we're taking that dashboard, and the team is working specifically with leadership at high schools to ensure that that number gets closer to 100% than anything under it. And so where we see disproportionality, it's being addressed very directly.
So the high impact strategies around well-being and cultural competency, we wanted to elevate well-being based on the feedback from this board as well as our community. And we have engaged with the Crown Institute on Be Well surveys, creating some baseline data for us, for students, families, and staff. That is a year-long process in which they're engaging in focus groups and will be providing recommendations at the end of the year and their findings in the summer of 2025. So we look forward to that information helping to guide our work and help identify strategies that we can bring forward as a result of those recommendations. Implicit bias, this is, as Dr. De La Cruz referenced before, ensuring that these are embedded within all of the professional learning that takes place. So whether we're talking about standards, whether we're talking about advanced coursework, it's embedded across all of those things. It's not something that's standalone, it's something that's embedded. You'll also see that the equity goals will be involved in every one of our schools as well. That's currently being implemented. From a discipline standpoint, we talked about the ongoing work for us to have confidence in the data provided through discipline. So the accuracy of that data, as well as that adherence to the discipline framework that we have in place. So providing the necessary support to building leaders and anyone who is going to be documenting on discipline to ensure that we're accurate and we're completed in that documentation so that we can identify where schools may or may not need support. And then everything that we've already talked around MTSS, we want to make sure that that's also included as we think about well-being and cultural competency. So continue with the gap analysis, professional learning, evidence collection, and then direct support from our strategic supports teams at 10 schools this year.
On the well-being stuff, on the well-being component of it, what information do we have now? I mean, it seems like we have more information already, and so it seems like there are things that we could be advancing further, realizing it's hard, it's good to think 5 years out, but I'd hate to think that it'll be the end of year 2 when we've got a plan now and we're actually starting implementation in year 3 because we used year 1 to gather the data for the baseline. So I'm disappointed to think of where we are now to be sort of launching a beginning to get data effort on it.
So we have a lot of strategies, not necessarily new strategies, ongoing strategies in regards to student well-being. I think that, what we've really tried to do based on board feedback and kind of staff input is try to determine what are the things that we're doing that are working, what are the things we're doing that are not working, and get that information in a way that's authentic, that's consistent, that we can count on, to then decide how we might change and shift the landscape moving forward. In a way that's responsible and is really considerate of how we're leveraging resources. And so the work is underway. There is lots of things happening in our schools right now to consider, how we support student well-being. Anything new is going to have to wait until after we have this deep analysis. But there is ongoing work that's happening to the extent that we're working and partnering closely with Renee Crown, and you all heard an in-depth 2-hour presentation from them very recently. And so hear your disappointment, understand that, and I would think that the responsible thing to do is to continue to let that play out, continue to, not cut any programs or stop anything we're doing, continue to do those things. As issues arise, at a school or in a community, obviously we'll lean in with the resources that we have. But before we would try to do anything new or anything different, we don't want to get ahead of our partners in giving us the critical information we need to be able to do that.
That makes total sense in terms of the long-term strategy. Just as a board member, I'm thinking back on the campaign when all the newly seated members talked as a high priority for what we were doing about well-being. And as we design our process, I'd love to hear more as we go through that about the things that we do know and the indicators that are there. So that's where I'm like, having it be such a priority, having so many things go on, I don't want to wait 18 months before we have another deep dive on what we know about it. Although I recognize the need to be strategic about what it is we plan to do through strategic planning and the UIP process and everything else. And I'm delighted by that evaluation process, but I don't want to wait 18 months before I get more information on how the kids are doing.
So as a reminder, board members, in the goal setting for the superintendent, you the annual benchmark 2 under indicator 4 by April 1, 2020 to 5, develop an action plan to improve student well-being based on results from Rake Wellness. So you all have acted on that already, you've directed me, and so we'll be moving forward.
Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So let's talk about implementation of these. Knowing that well-being is a complex concept, it's inclusive of the social, emotional, behavioral, mental health, development of the whole person, and it's essential for success. As Board Member Medler indicated, it's essential for the success of young people and adults. And so the direction that we took from the board last spring was to not only know our current landscape, but to understand how we are serving our young people and what we need to do better. And so from that was born the partnership with the Renee Crown Institute, and the Be Well surveys, which are currently open, and I believe they close next week, are that needs assessment for us to understand how we are serving our young people and how we can do better. And so these needs assessments will not only help us to understand the current landscape, but also inform our planning, as Dr. Anderson indicated, for next steps in programmatic and staffing resources and choices, since both education and access to care lead to improved quality of life outcomes. So as part of the whole child experience, we also know that discipline and response to behaviors is a piece of that puzzle. So we're striving for increased accuracy in assigning disciplinary resolutions to student actions relative to the baseline. So increasing that systematic knowledge and accuracy through our Vortex meetings with principals, through our monthly behavior and data meetings with the central office core team, and use of the new matrix guidance document to help schools make appropriate decisions, and lots of specific follow-up and collaboration and support for school leaders around each of those. Also part of well-being, students feeling included and valued, and so in support of that, each of our non-charter schools has created an equity goal that's part of their UIP to be implemented this year. And those goals are in development. Some are complete, as I indicated. They're being monitored. They've been created not only in response to data, but in collaboration with our executive directors and more of a comprehensive look. Those UIPs are due today. So definitely all of those goals will be in, but I know that our executive team discusses these and that our executive directors are monitoring the goal development closely. As a piece of that, feeling valued and included, we want to make sure that we're embedding, as we've indicated before, professional learning, not only around standards that are grade level, engaging, affirming, and meaningful, but also around culturally relevant pedagogy and cultural competency. And we've again named those same district and leadership PD dates here. And as I indicated earlier, we are anchoring to the evidence-based research of Zaretta Hammond, as well as the concept of grade level engaging, affirming and meaningful delivery of standards, and looking at equity being in the details of teaching and learning and what happens in the classroom. We can pause here for questions or discussion.
We have more PD dates in the second semester, right? There's more opportunities for
There are more
development.
coming, and we will continue to update the board as those occur. We just wanted to bring you essentially what has occurred so far. But that first bullet point, all of the district-directed PD days and late start sessions will have these embedded in them.
I like the approach of more meetings focusing on the behavioral data and thinking about the accuracy of the data. And you mentioned auditing of that. I'm kind of curious what that kind of looks like, what the levels are in terms of the auditing, and kind of how you link the behavior to the discipline response. And if, I know there's strategic support teams that are coming out, are they going to be involved in that process as well for those schools that they're dealing with? I'd like to hear just a little bit more about how we get at that accuracy, because it's so tricky.
I would call it a comprehensive approach that's multifaceted, in that we have a team We have a director of behavior and engagement who specifically is working directly with our schools team and our principals and assistant principals around that accuracy, both proactively and in response. Our Vortex meetings, which happen quarterly, are deep dives into accuracy, compliance, and looking at proportionality or disproportionality of data and what decisions are going to be made, what planning is going to be putting into changing disproportionality in those. Our executive team is working closely with our schools and leadership teams, and those Vortex meetings include not just our school leaders, but also others who are engaged in disciplinary responses at the schools, like deans and other teacher leaders, counselors also attend. And those are led by Kathleen Sullivan as well as Senan Nauer, our Director of Behavior and Engagement. But they're a really collaborative experience that are experiential and diving into the data to address issues both in response and, as I said, making plans for forward thinking to do differently. Also, it's not uncommon for Senan, the Director of Behavior and Engagement, to call principals up or consult with them around decisions being made. And that's something that we've implemented new this year, to have more of that proactive consultation around disciplinary decisions that are being made, to look at what alternatives might be, to look at the whole student, and to consider all of the dimensions of a situation, of a behavior, of the function of the behavior, and as well as the student themselves.
Is this where we track restorative processes as well? Like, if we're using a restorative justice process, are we tracking that as well in this particular area?
We are tracking restorative practices, implementation in schools and occurrences. And is that part of your data set today, Jonathan? Or Claire? So that's part of our dashboards, and we're tracking that and having conversations around it. I just didn't remember if it was part of the data set today.
And it's one of the areas where we have targets in the UIP.
I guess I just would like to be sure that we're understanding that we're trying to reduce recidivism on these things, and are we tracking student
Yes.
to student?
And I do recall that comment last time we were together, and we have incorporated that into our looks at the dashboards and the data that we're tracking. Thank you for that.
I guess, I think this is a parking lot issue, but I see that we are measuring a lot of the district-directed PD, but I know that we have a much bigger array of things that go into that. And I'd be curious to get updated at some point on it, to understand the array of things any teacher in BVSD experiences that we would consider PD and support, and then to figure out if there's anything else to mine there, whether it's asynchronous stuff they're doing or school and department-directed stuff, just to understand the whole milieu of what is going on in terms of the teacher development. So I realize that's total off target for today, but it seems like we're focusing on the PD that's district-directed when I don't even know what % of the PD a teacher experiences that is.
There's a lot there. There's a lot there. I think that our teachers are amazing. They develop themselves each and every day, sometimes on the clock, a lot of times off the clock. Hard to kind of quantify and measure in a way that that maybe captures all of that. I think that things that we put in our UIPs are things that we have control over, but we could certainly we can do some analysis of that. But to the extent that the tighter you measure those things, the less flexibility maybe our professionals have in kind of seeking out those opportunities, and at a certain point it becomes counterproductive.
Yeah, I totally respect your judgment about how to do that. I just want to know how limited my view is from thinking about the district. Like, are we talking about the thing we control that's easy to measure, that's 5% of the teachers', learning experience, or 50%? That's just trying to get a sense of it on something that I'm totally ignorant of, and then completely deferential to you about how we would understand it, but I don't know how to think about that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, and our best teachers are constantly developing themselves and would put themselves through more rigorous professional development opportunities than we could ever require or ask, and it's tricky. I mean, we can think more about that. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I appreciate the question.
Is it possible to see the new matrix or to get a document for the board to see that? I have not seen that since it was the very first one was developed when I was part of the DAC. So if we could see that, I would be just curious, and I think it'd be helpful for the board members to understand what some of those indicators and the codes are that we are tracking. Thanks.
Time check. I forgot to assign a timekeeper, Board President Rajpal. So it's 10:10. We've gotten through 25% of the topics. I think we can get through the strategic plan support team's topic pretty quickly, and there might be opportunity for a break.
Great. We have just a couple slides here to take a look at the preliminary work of the strategic plan support teams and the developing detail of their collaborative work with schools and how they're elevating evidence-based practices in schools and the school experience. So you can see here the 10 schools that are in cohort 1. These schools were selected based on a variety of factors. We selected heterogeneous groupings of schools by design, and we plan for each cohort to be heterogeneous and also to include schools in each of the 3 networks, schools receiving different levels of differentiated funding. We based some of our decision-making, of course, on data sets, including CMAS and the School Performance Framework, and a school readiness assessment. And we really are focused on building on success and refining even greater consistency at schools. So with school leaders, staff, and community who are ready to engage and go deeper in the work of the strategic plan around grade level, standards-based instruction, MTSS structures for both academics and behavior, and data-driven instruction. So all of those factors went into selecting the schools. In terms of the structure, I know that we've shared the overall structure, but what you see on the right is the structure of support. So we have 2 strategic plan support teams. Each is made of 1 strategic plan support administrator. It's not catchy, and it doesn't easily roll off the tongue. And an instruction and behavior coach and a data-driven instruction coach. And of course, 10 schools each year, 5 in each cohort. We have, it's been tricky to hire the instruction and behavior coach. We do have 1 very qualified person, and we've reposted that position to get that second person. So Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about what's on the left here?
Yeah, thank you. So as you know, we've talked a little bit about this. There's going to be 3 cohorts over the next 3 years, so 10 schools over 3 each year. And then the 2 teams, as Dr. De La Cruz referenced, and then the first year of that cohort is the really intense support, identifying where each of those schools are and progressing them in the acceleration of the strategic initiatives, so specifically around MTSS, around DDI, around standards, all the things that we've talked about here today. And then they're going to move into a monitoring in year 2 and beyond. So not saying they're going to have everything finalized and everything figured out. We're going to solve all of the issues in year 1, but we are going to take great steps and make great progress and accelerate the implementation of those things, and then be that guide on the side in year 2 and beyond. And this is also in a reference to the work that we've done within UVA. So really this stems from that model that we've seen a lot of success in, and being able to provide that very intense support around the development of those structures that we know are going to benefit students. And so our strategic support administrators are experienced in being able to do that and being able to help leaders in the development of those things. And then the instructional and behavior coach and the data-driven instructional coach are going to be in buildings working along with schools or working side by side with teachers in the development of those things as well. And then wanted to highlight the annual benchmark here for Dr. Anderson as well.
And so what the teams have been up to date are they've been attending the strategic school improvement meetings. They've been working with principals and leadership teams on 90-day plans, UIP development. They've been attending 2 MTSS and DDI planning and needs assessments with school leaders, attending leadership team meetings, getting to know school teams, building relationships, all are essential for the work to move forward, and providing whatever necessary support and partnership needed during the launch, and really triangulating the data that they've been looking at in order to establish next steps with the school. We've envisioned that year 1 is a strong, intensive learning year, and with the hope that as we accomplish these non-negotiables at each school, the schools being really well poised to be model schools or lab schools for their peers and their colleagues and for the next cohort.
I was going to ask what does intensive support look like? I think, Laura, you got into what is it? So I guess that's what the school, what the outside teams are going to provide to the school. What does it mean for the teachers? What does it look like for does their professional development change? Do there anything in terms of kind of the teacher-principal relationship or meetings? I'm just curious to know what that looks like at the school level.
Their in-house or school-based professional learning is likely to be informed by what was found in the data and at the strategic school improvement conversations and meetings. And the folks on the team, the strategic support teams, are available to co-plan and co-facilitate that professional learning, to support the school in the provision of data, to facilitate data-driven instruction conversations and meetings, to be at the table for MTSS, to really be that guide on the side, but also providing foundational pieces that are needed in order to move the school forward.
So clarifying question, as we continue to talk about these 10 schools per year in a cohort, I've been having a little bit of like, oh man, this is going to take us 5 years to get through that first cohort. But what I heard you just say, wanted to clarify, the schools that have been participating in the UVA aren't going to go through, are they going to go through this plan, or are they, because they're already doing their own work through the UVA program, they are set aside and then there are fewer of the schools, and so it won't take quite 5 years?
Yes, exactly that.
I feel so much better. Thank you.
At the end of 3 years, all schools K through 8 will have gone through this process.
That's great, because that's the math I've been doing mentally, like minus our charter schools, and then I was like, oh wait, now we can subtract the UVA schools, so 3 years. Thank you. So board members, should we pause here for a 5-minute comfort break? Okay, welcome back from that brief adjournment, board members. I do want to, one reminder as we start to get into the data itself that I wanted to share was to re-elevate what Dr. Anderson led at the beginning of today's meeting, that really keeping in mind, what do you draw from this data, and so what, then what? And with that, I would like to hand it back over to Dr. De La Cruz and her team.
So as Jonathan guides us through the comparative data for student groups, we have a lot of data to share, and we want to make sure that board members understand, and if you have questions or anything's confusing, that you certainly ask those questions. And in the interest of time, we'd like to be able to share a set of the data and then pause kind of naturally for questions there. However, in launching, Jonathan's going to spend some time really explaining the view so that we all have a common shared understanding of what we're looking at together.
All right, President Rajpal, members of the board, Dr. Anderson. So what I'd like to go over is some data that shows our comparative performance on growth, which is shown here on the vertical axis, and achievement shown on the horizontal axis. And this is in comparison with eight other districts. that have some relative similarity to us overall, though they obviously vary within that. This is the one view we'll have that's of the whole scale, right? This shows the full range of growth that's possible, though much of the data is focused when you're talking about district level averages here and about the middle third of that in the achievement data also. So for this first slide, we're going to zoom in a bit on the view that we just have, and the arrow points at the orange dot. The orange dot is the Boulder Valley achievement mean scale score for free and reduced lunch eligible students, and also the median growth percentile, right? So the gray crosshatch there, the thicker gray line that we're right on the middle of, that puts us very much in the position of average growth relative to these other 8 districts and average achievement. And by average growth, of course, I mean median growth percentile, which would show that a student who's free and reduced lunch eligible in Boulder Valley grows about at the same rate as other kids do in these 8 other districts. This is also one where you've got the bubbles aren't the same size. In this case, the size of the bubble reflects the percent free and reduced lunch. And you can see which other districts there have a higher percentage than us by a substantial amount, such as Denver and Adams 12. And we see that there are a couple that have lower amounts, Douglas and Littleton. Before we go on, does this slide make sense as far as what people are seeing? Because we're going to get a whole bunch more that look just like this with the bubbles moving around. Awesome. All right. So the picture in math is that our comparative performance is a little higher than our peers by a fairly small amount in terms of growth and achievement both. When we look at the performance of emerging bilingual students, however, the results are, in terms of English language arts, lower than what we're seeing by our peer districts. The picture in math is a little better in terms of growth, right? More comparable to what we're seeing. But when we see data like this, we do end up wanting to dig in a little harder to understand more. And in terms of data on emerging bilinguals, we have access growth showing how well our kids are doing as far as English language acquisition in the areas of reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So we see that, again, that this is access, not this GMAS growth we were looking at. We are a little lower than our peer districts in this regard. Looking at this, digging into this a little harder, we see that it's not at high school that we're a little lower, but really it's a middle and elementary level performance that's contributing to that. And if we push it just at one level further, we get to individual schools, and we note here the ones that are, and we look at this too by size. So this is the vertical axis here shows how many students took the access, and this is and had a growth score from the prior year. And we've labeled the buildings that are getting lower than what the BVSD average is there overall. So that's a bit of a deeper dive into the result for emerging bilinguals.
So we can pause here for questions. I also want to share that our cultural and linguistically diverse education team is very aware of needs that we have around serving and supporting our multilingual learners. And I do want to share some of the commitments that the team has made and is moving forward with under the direction of our Chief Academic Officer, Dr. Nativity Miller. So we now have a new English Language Development, or ELD, teacher leader position this year at our dual language elementary schools. And they're assisting with co-planning with content teachers to ensure that sheltered English is not overlooked, sheltered English instruction. We have a CLDE, Culturally Linguistically Diverse Education, TOSA, coaching the ELD teacher leader, and we also teacher leaders, and also being housed 1 day a week at each of the bilingual schools for drop-in, for support, and as needed sessions around the HMH Arriba la Lectura reading program, with a strong focus on new educators as well, just knowing we want to fortify and strengthen instruction in Spanish and English at all of our schools. And we want to also be hyper-focused on our students who are learning in two languages, which is a more complex endeavor. On the October Professional Development Day, as well as in February coming, the CLDE team is bringing all 3 dual language elementary schools together to reinforce biliteracy and look at comparative analysis within the HMH units. We've really up-leveled the monthly ELD teacher meetings with all teachers, including those from dual language schools, and focusing on identifying students with low, adequate, and high growth on access. So we are hyper-focused on the growth and achievement of our students who are learning in 2 languages. That's followed up with ongoing monthly professional development to continue to have teachers focus attention on the students who are identified to principals and teachers as being in the low, adequate, and high growth areas, with recommendations about how to support the students who are in the category of low growth. The CLDE team has created data sheets with English and Spanish reading data from September on, and have divided that data to look at grade level performance. So we're getting even more precise in how we're supporting our educators and our students, looking at a performance trajectory and specific questions about data that's shared with principals. And those include follow-up meetings and conversation with principals, inclusive of our directors of teaching and learning, so that everyone on the team is in the same conversation. Dr. Miller hosts monthly administrator meetings now with our dual language principals, and with those include classroom observations, learning, and leadership development and problem solving in collaboration, of course, with the leadership of Kristen Nelson-Steinhoff, who is leading the CLDE work. And then we have ongoing coaching and program development, as well as we are beginning to contemplate revisiting the discussion around language supports in math specifically, because we're looking at math performance in our dual language schools as well, and for our multilingual learners across the system. So we have some great language overlay documents that were created by the ELD team, and the team is looking at offering those up for planning at the dual language schools as well. We know that an area of growth is in our working closely with our school leadership across our dual language schools at elementary and programming at middle level, as well as our high school content teachers. And we are in full support, of course, of our full implementation of co-teaching, and we're carefully monitoring the growth of our access scores in our co-taught classrooms comparatively to other classrooms. And I wanted to share all that with you because I know that Dr. Miller and Kristen Nelson-Steinhoff and I want to make sure that you know that we are carefully monitoring this data and that we have robust plans in place to address the growth that we're seeing, to make sure that our multilingual learners are having the growth and achievement experiences that we all want them to.
On this chart here, this is for the emerging bilinguals or for the, if I'm thinking about Uni Hill, Pioneer, Columbine, our dual language schools, is that the whole school population, or is there a distinction of emerging bilinguals and native English speakers who are doing the dual language program?
Right. So it's on the access. So it's only emerging bilinguals and who've been there sufficiently long to have a couple of years scores. So access is given in mid-January to mid-February. So these are kids who've been enrolled at least a couple of years and taken the test each time.
Right, I guess I'm looking at more of the definition of emerging bilingual. So that would be a student who's a non-native English speaker who's then learning English, or is it a student
is
who's
not
a
yet
native
at the-
speaker who's learning Spanish and English?
The students who take the access test are ones whose first language isn't English.
Isn't English, okay. And I guess my question is, because, Columbine, Pioneer, Uni Hill seem to have a large number of that population, right? Would we expect the same kind of growth trend, given that they're in a dual language program that might be 50-50, 90-10 at that age in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade? Or do we see more? I know you don't see the pickup till middle school, so it might make sense. It might make sense to pull this out a little bit.
Yeah, you're thinking about a lot of the questions that we've been thinking about, right? As a model, so for the public and for board members, we have different models of dual language schools. A 90-10 model, which starts with in kindergarten, students get 90% of their instruction in non-English and then 10% in English, and then that shifts up to 50-50, goes 80-20. 70-30s, with the idea and then some do 50-50, half in English, half in Spanish, and they do that every year. With the idea that, from what I know, and please correct me if I misspeak, but the idea is that by 8th grade, you're fluent in both languages. We used, as we think about how do we support CLDE and our emerging bilingual students, as a reminder, for some of you were not on the board at the time, we did bring in an outside group to audit our practices, to provide us guidance and direction on what should we do. Dual Language New Mexico, and we're free to give you that audit. We did something similar with special education. We've done something similar with UVA. Like we leverage outside expertise to give us the direction on what works, and then we focus on building out and implementing what works. So as you look at data where amongst peer groups, it appears that especially in ELA and access, growth and achievement is behind peer school districts, those subgroups. We wanted to do a little bit of digging. We have certainly some robust plans for this year. And to the extent that we feel like we're doing what we want to do, then the question is that the thing that works or not? Now, we've had somebody advise us on that. We've looked at the research on that. That's what we're working towards, a co-teaching model. We know that some of our peer districts with high performance have utilized this model as well. It was very new. Think about it like this. If I were to compare this to special education, going from all center-based programs to then inclusionary models. Right? And this is kind of the same premise with our emerging bilinguals, where you have teachers teaching content knowledge with a push-in co-teacher. So kids are getting access to grade level content with the language support, as opposed to being pulled out, getting lots of language support, potentially maybe not grade level content as their peers are getting. So I guess I share all that to say that that this is, amongst the challenges you'll see today, this is number one, right? This is something that we need to kind of keep an eye on, but I am confident in our team and in our approach. And like some of the things that we've tried the first couple of years, right? It just takes some time to grow roots, but we'll be prepared to pivot and make additional decisions, as data comes forward.
And I just want to say, I appreciate the fact that we are looking at this data in this way, and that because looking at the data and asking why and why and why and really digging down is going to help us really improve educational opportunities and experiences for these kids. So lots of questions that you're thinking about, that we're all thinking about, and the transparency over this data really helps us do what's best for kids. So I just want to say I appreciate that, even though if it's not as rosy as we'd like it to be today, it'll help us to get to where we need to be for our students.
Yeah, I totally ditto what you just said. I really appreciate the seriousness and the opportunity to ask the extra whys. And two things for me is sometimes I think about these charts and I really think about what the 4 quadrants mean for, to bring to people's attention. And so when you're in the lower left, you've got both low growth and low achievement. And when you have low growth, it's hard to catch up on the achievement front.
We're right. So, but on the chart people are looking at now, that's actually an N.
I'm sorry,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm thinking of the quadrant charts if you back up. And I think sometimes it helps people to think about what it means to be in the different quadrants of those charts. And so for the emerging bilingual students, we've got both low growth and low achievement, which means that's not a surprise then that later on you'd be still farther behind. The other thing for me is I think it's helpful when we're dealing with a subgroup to include, when we can visually, the comparison group of the emerging bilingual students to the non-emerging bilingual students. And I've shared with Rob some graphics of that really give you a sense of not just where they are relative to other emerging bilinguals, but what the discrepancy is between them and the other students within the district. And then you get a sense of what's going on between in terms of closing achievement and opportunity gaps, which I think is really helpful sort of in the political budgetary world to say, hey, we're not just trying to become better at serving bilingual students and not become the lowest growth and achievement amongst these 9 districts. We want to actually be closing the gap between these students and other students, depending on whatever the subgroup is. So I would like to, in the future, be able to see a combination of the discrepancy between the subgroup and the rest of the group, and also this analysis, which is all really helpful. And I think as we think about communicating to the public around these things, I think helping them understand what the quadrants mean in terms of their implications are 2 really helpful pieces to consider.
And that's kind of, I really appreciate that point. I think, one, I love the data. I appreciate the transparency and how much access we have. And 2, I think my question about who the emerging bilinguals are and what's the appropriate comparison group was that maybe we shouldn't expect the growth to be equal at the lower grade levels because of the different models. And then the catch up might happen later. So be really mindful of who the appropriate comparison group is, because we're serving in a very different sort of way with those different models.
No, absolutely. And to the extent that we've really planted a flag in this idea that we want as many students to be bilingual as possible, and that is a value add when they graduate. And if you go back to the access data, now I don't, when you see, gosh, when they get to high school, the other one, right? How does high school so much, is that a result of our model, or is it just do emerging? But, do our students who take access, do they stay in elementary through high school? Like that, there's a lot that I don't want to misinterpret or misanalyze, but I do think that that's the question, right? To the extent that we know that we're having more students graduate, more native speakers graduating with seal of biliteracy, and that's like something we value. Which are expectations beyond CMAS? So, okay.
So on the next pair of slides, we'll be looking at the performance of Hispanic students, and we'll note here that the dots now are all the same size. That's just a limitation in what's available to us for this particular view. Not saying all these districts have the same percentage of Hispanic students, but we can see here that we're in that position of making growth that's about comparable with achievement that's a little lower in English language arts. And again, the picture in math is a little bit better, but in this case, a little bit better means about comparable to what we're seeing across districts. Turning now to students who are served through an individualized education plan, we see that our growth and achievement are higher in English language arts than most of most of these comparable districts, and in math, again, right, you're hearing a theme here that the performance in math is again even better than in English language arts. For our gifted and talented students, and I was note I had to move the axes over here a little bit. This performance is appreciably higher in terms of achievement and to an extent growth also. We see that our performance isn't as high. And at the same time, we want to be really cautious about this particular comparison. Boulder Valley has 16% of its population being identified as talented and gifted. Two of the districts on this comparison slide have half that. Most of the others have around 11, and there's one that has 13, and that's Adams 12. So as we look at this comparison, and I recognize for a number of the comparisons, I could have said, yeah, there's some other things to look out for in terms of how comparable are our groups and the cautions we would offer. This is one where it's a pretty substantial difference. And again, we see in math, the picture is a little better than in English language arts here, approaching but not reaching the mean and median of other districts' performance.
I think what stands out to me is after our audit for our special education programming and the extensive work that we have put in, it shows up here. And where you put your focus and where you put your energy is where you see improvements. And I will say we have not for a very long time put focus or energy or thought into our students that qualify for gifted and talented programming. And that also shows here. And so as we move forward as a district and are trying to serve all students, being mindful of where we focus, really we do see results, which is amazing. And where we don't, it's a little bit harder. And I hear your caveat there, but something that definitely stands out, and I know that the board members have heard from the community for quite some time around like frustrations around gifted and talented programming and access to advanced coursework for some of those kids. So I just wanted to elevate that a little bit as well. Kitty.
So thank you for all of this. I was noticing the same things, and especially the special ed, but what I would be interested in seeing is our data compared to ourselves in the past, to see how much, we've improved on what we've been doing and the impact that has made. Follow-up question to that. Do we still have the greatest achievement gap in the metro area, or I think it was in the state at one time?
It's a fuzzy measure to kind of dial in. I would love to say no. I do think that, to Alex's point, if you were to see the performance of our non-free and reduced lunch students, our students not on IEP, students not English language learners, and you did that comparison across school districts across the state, that's how you would, I think, see that. The interesting thing about all of this data is that, so we've got a handful of areas where we're above the pack, handful of areas we're in the middle of the pack, handful of areas we're below the pack, and within the context of the highest achieving district in the metro, right? So there's lots there for us, I think, to look at and to kind of think about. Nicole, your point is well taken. What does that look like? And Jonathan, your point's well taken, right? It's kind of like, it's sometimes what you measure and what you talk about, you just have to be careful about, right? So when I was a high school principal, we had, I was at a high school in Orlando, nowhere around here, where teachers prided themselves on their AP pass rates, right? But the trick was they weren't letting in any kids who weren't going to pass before they took the class, right? So in this school, at my school in Orlando, right, we pressed to create greater access, knowing that pass rates would go down, right? And that you'd have some more 3s, less 4s and 5s, and you'd have more kids with the experience. Gifted and talented, there isn't a unified way to identify gifted and talented across the state of Colorado. Everybody has their own way system, right? And so I think that you have to be careful not to overreact to something that Are we more inclusive? Are we less exclusive? Does it matter? Are we as inclusive as we want to be? Now, that doesn't say that we need to not to work on programming, right? And you could improve programming, and maybe those data don't change. But the fact that we're having these high-level, in-depth conversations on subgroups in ways that, for 7 years, we haven't done this, I think is just a testament to the work that our team is doing. Most districts would trade places with us in a second. And we are still raising the bar higher for each and every kid. And so I'm really, really proud of that. I really appreciate Alex's point. I appreciate Kitty's point on what are some new and different ways we can look at this over time. Comparing those groups, getting the gaps, but comparing ourselves over time. And so we'll take those feedback back. But great job to our team for really digging in, asking the right questions, getting to that 5 whys that really get you to root cause, to get you closer to what the issues could potentially be, and just tons of confidence in our team that the areas that we focus on, we know we're going to get better at. So.
All right. So looking at some other data that's important. We see one favorable area of comparison is our relatively low rate of chronic absence. This is missing 10% or more of the days of school, and this is a positive that we're seeing. Also, with all the work that's been done regarding discipline, BVSD disciplines comparatively fewer students than neighboring large Front Range districts, which are the ones that you've seen on the past slide. All right, and what this shows is the number of students who are disciplined compared to enrollment overall, and that line of best fit. What you see is Boulder Valley is well below the line. So we have some way of thinking about what's our relative use of discipline, and then refining this a little further, even fewer with regard to out of school suspensions, where a great deal of work has been placed recently. So we have here a sort of a context and a way of thinking about the use of these practices and successes around attendance.
And just back to that other last slide, this is outlier data, right? We're an outlier amongst the Front Range and how we're leveraging alternatives to suspension, restorative practices to keep our kids in school. And anybody who's watching who wants to know what we're doing, we invite you to come meet with our team. But in an area where, and I think many of you read the Chalkbeat article that was pushed out maybe a month ago, where discipline is out of control across the state. Not in Boulder Valley, it's not. And this is hard work from our teachers, our administrators, our support teams, our legal counsel. Like, everybody has put our heart and soul into doing something that's really right, which is keeping kids in school and finding ways to be able to intervene, not de-escalate situations, try to get kids to know and understand why what they did wasn't right, learn from that, become better humans. And I think that this is just, it's incredible evidence of that.
Yeah, first off, I just want to reiterate how grateful I am for the team and Dr. Stings and De La Cruz for just the great work for all of this. So I really do want to reiterate how impressed I am by the candor and what you're facilitating in terms of our discussion and our analysis and how it supports people. So nice job. On this last one, I think it would be powerful to see it as percentages. I think that graphic is better at showing us the relationship between the size of the enrollment and the issue, and that's not what the question is. The question is, like, how many of the students are we doing it? So I think it would be faster and more intuitive for an audience to work on a percent on this one. And if I can, before we go on, I'd go back to the gifted and talented front, and I do think it's I agree with Nicole that, like, you know, when we focus on something, we can make a great difference. And if we do the right stuff, and that we don't have a record of focusing on the talented and gifted. And I would connect that to like our declining enrollment issues. And so at some level, we want to make sure we're keeping our neurodiverse students and serving them, including the twice exceptional, that we're accelerating things for the gifted students who feel like they belong in their school, and our MTSS system is helping us figure that out. So all those things work together. And I think we can continue to prioritize in what we're doing. And I think the gifted and talented population might be another one that's up for one of those studies. If we haven't done one, maybe we haven't, I don't know about it. That would inform what we do next to figure out how we do that with resources we have available for it. Or if we don't have the extra resources for it, because I know it's not a funded thing really from the state, how do we incorporate that into our development of the MTSS or the DDI processes and figure out a way to prioritize it there.
So last I checked, we get about $100 a kid to provide them robust, challenging, gifted, and talented curriculum. You know, I think the great news is, so yes, and we've had the state has come in and do an audit, but we haven't had any national experts come in and do an audit there. I think this is something we could consider in prioritization. You know, to the extent that implementing some of those models would break some of the other models that we have, is a real thing, right? You know, if folks want to have a pull-out gifted, talented program, right, then it breaks some of these inclusive models that we've built around co-teaching, inclusion for special education. So lots to consider, right? And I know that that this is an important topic for us, and yeah, the funding for sure isn't there. We would have to take it from somewhere else.
I just want to, again, highlight the outstanding work this district really has done around restorative practices, around looking at our discipline practices, around out-of-school suspensions. And yes, that multi-page article that was republished in the Daily Camera and making it look like we're doing a terrible job because it was really focused on DPS. This is really the counter argument that we are really doing the right work when it comes to discipline and restorative practices and out-of-school suspensions. And it's great to see, once again, where we focus our energies and we really get consistent and tight in our practices, we do see positive results for our students.
And just one acknowledgement, really want to thank those folks that over the past 5 years, 6 years have served on our Latino Parent Advisory Council, who pushed this district to do better in this area, brought it to light in ways that only true partnership can accomplish. And while some of those folks aren't involved as much today, those efforts, those seeds planted 5-6 years ago have made a lasting impact, especially on our Latino students who, as a reminder, we've reduced the number of suspensions for Latino students by 51% during that same time. And it just, I think, goes to show how do you genuinely engage partners in your community in ways that make you better.
Okay, I think I'm up. Good morning, everybody. Oh, I got it. So I'm back with an update this morning about the data dashboards that we presented and spoke about back in August. We're going to dig in on one area specifically around the metrics for tiered support. So really appreciated your thoughtful feedback on that first draft of the key performance indicators. And one piece of feedback that we heard clearly from you was when we do look at performance among students in that focus area of tiered support, we should also be putting a lens on specifically those students who received that support. So that's where we dug in today, and I'll be presenting some updates and data specifically around students who have received academic interventions. As you've also seen today, talking about some of our implementation metrics and strategies, one of those items within tiered supports is to improve our documentation of interventions for students. So I will talk through some nuance in terms of the data that we have today, knowing that we're making efforts right now to increase the, I guess, the cleanliness and the completeness of this data as well. So I'll touch on those pieces. Okay. So diving in, just as a reminder, this was what I had shared back in August, looking at our focus area of tiered supports. Our key metric here is growth, specifically our state summative growth across CMAS, PSAT, SAT. So what we had looked at that time were growth metrics for all students and a couple of our focus groups, FRL eligible students, Hispanic Latino students. I'm also focusing here on 2 years of historic growth as well. So that was just a reminder what we had. What I will be adding to the mix today is this deeper dive on interventions. So just as a starting place, I wanted to share a little of the nitty-gritty here of which students are being included. So in the past few years, when we look at our academic intervention data, we track that in a couple of key ways. So one of those ways are course enrollments that captures our students at the secondary level. So here that would be students who are enrolled in and completed a math support class or a language arts support class. And we also have documentation systems through our MTSS processes in our buildings. So that is documenting specific intervention plans, and in some cases, specific programs, particularly in reading, and I'll get to that data as well. We can unpack that more. But what I'm showing you here in this table are the numbers of students, first of all, who we identified with a documented intervention. This is just pulling a sample of school year 23-24. And then I narrowed that list down to which of those students have growth data in the state summative assessment in a connected content area. So if a student received a math intervention, do they have math growth data? And as you'll see, that just whittles down the numbers a little bit more. So I just wanted to give an idea of just the base rates of what we're looking at here. Also note, content area to content area, we have at this time a lot more documentation and intervention programs within reading compared to math. So you see that those numbers stand out very much in this table.
So this is across tabs of those two variables against the other ones for math and reading, right? And the state summative growth data would be 3 through 8, the CMAS and PSAT and SAT in high school, right? So as part of the big difference on the lower right box, the 1192, is that partially a function of we do a lot of reading interventions earlier before anyone takes a test, and it's not until the 4th grade is there a CMAS growth score?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Thanks for checking understanding on that. That's helpful.
That was sort of along my lines of the question too. So the students who are the math support class, these are only secondary students, right? We don't have math interventionists at the elementary level, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
So on the documented in MTSS process, the interventions, could it be multiple interventions per student, or is it, intervention in general per student?
I'm trying to think if we would have multiple. It could have multiple, and actually in this case, there could be some overlap in students in a support class and receiving a specific intervention program as well. Yes.
But there wouldn't be students double counted in like the 651. That wouldn't be John is in there twice because they'd only have the one score.
So this is when we get to the scores. Yes, I'm just pausing because these are numbers of students. But I believe it would be one per student because this is, this is within one school year. Yeah.
So you're coding a student and say, John was in a math class, so he counts in that cell. And then John had 1 to 8 interventions, so he counts in the next cell.
That could happen on this table, yes. But when we get to the growth data, there will not be double counting. Yeah, thank you. Yes. All right. So as we move from here, so here is what that looks like incorporating these cohorts of students into our growth metric on the key performance indicators. So a couple things to note, students are matched up by content area. So again, the content in which they received the intervention, we're looking at those growth metrics. So you received a reading intervention, we look at your reading growth, math with math. And I've just added in this as another subgroup of students to compare with the others that we had looked at previously in that top chart. And then down below, that is giving a 2-year comparison of this data. And now left to right, we have a comparison of those, again, identified students with a documented intervention in reading or math, and then pretty much just all their students, no documented reading intervention. So that's, as you can see, a very large comparison group on the right side. I think, the big story that stands out here is we are seeing the results for students who did receive an intervention approaching the 50th percentile, and then particularly math in the 23-24 school year is standing out. That's at the 54th percentile. And I'll break it down a little bit more, but that's kind of the big picture story to start with.
What are the gray boxes? And could we label them if they're there for a reason?
Oh, in the backgrounds? Yeah, so those are the cut points that the state uses for growth ratings. And yes, I can add labels to those.
Yeah, without knowing what they are, they're just distracting to me. But if I knew what they are, then I have a better sense of how I'm supposed to interpret them.
Sounds good.
Is this a more helpful look, board members? I mean, you give up numbers of students that qualify, and what you get is a more focused kids working through interventions. So you don't get everything you want, right? But I guess the question would be to give clear direction. Is this the look that we'd want to change these tiered supports to, versus the look that we had originally, which was looking at growth from all students without considering who was in or was not in intervention? Growth is defined by median growth percentile, right? I have that right.
I think it's helpful for you all, right, data to be looking at. And as we consider the types of interventions and what types of growth are you seeing for specific interventions and how does that compare? I mean, the dialing down and all that really nebulous data, I think, is important for our practitioners, for the folks that are doing the work, that are doing the planning, that are supporting in our schools. For me, it's interesting. Doesn't change what I do as a board member, but it's nice to know that you're looking at it and you might come along and say, AROI indicates that we should maybe reconsider this program or this intervention. We're not seeing the growth as much. And so that's where I'm thinking about this data in my capacity as a board member.
Yeah, I think this is a move in the right direction. I think in terms of it's closer to what we want to see if we're focused on the UIP, our goals. So I think that comparison is important, right? Because that's what our goals are focusing on.
I'll be honest, the first time I was looking at these dashboards, I was really trying to figure out what I was supposed to be trying to do in my head with it. And I think the top half is really different from the bottom half. And so in addition to labeling the gray boxes, I might really focus on like the bottom half. If this is about the tiered interventions, I would separate the two into two different things, because it's really helpful to know how are the students with the tiered interventions in terms of a population with historically lower scores. So I understand, I think of the top half as there I can say, are students needing interventions doing better or worse than the performance gap that we have for our free and reduced price lunch students? And that's a helpful question. And then the bottom half if I can think it through, I'm thinking about, okay, well, are the interventions working? And are they making a difference? And they're two they seem like different things, and it takes a long time to get there. So I'd probably do two different graphics for it. And then on the bottom half, I'm honestly trying to figure out, is it important for me, like the most important thing is that incremental difference in the lower left category for the math, for the median growth percentile from 23 to 24. So we see like, well, that's a pretty significant bump from 47 to 54%. But I'm not sure if I was supposed to compare 54 to 58 and talk about it closing the achievement gap, or see that from 47 to 58 was an 11% gap and now we've closed it. So I'm not really sure where my eye or my mind is supposed to go for the analysis in the bottom. So I'm doubly confused by what's the purpose of the top versus the bottom. And then when I get to the bottom, I'm not sure which way to go in terms of which comparison I'm supposed to be making. And then all of it, I'm confused by whether the grays are something of meaning.
So we have a lot of information that you could look at a bunch of different ways. We can hone that down if the board would come to some kind of a consensus on what that would look like. I do think that, the idea that I think the answer could be both, right? I actually do think that, and because we don't do randomized control trials in the Boulder Valley School District, right? We don't give some kids who can't read no intervention and others intervention and see how effective the stuff we do works. We don't do that. If you need it, we give it to you. And from a statistical analysis perspective, that is the gold standard to know and understand implementation effectiveness, is the idea of rolling out randomized controls. We're just not going to do that. So in light of that, knowing and understanding year over year differences for interventions and growth and comparisons through the year, like, when I think of, gosh, with the intervention, kids almost match the growth of kids who didn't need any intervention at all. Man, that feels really good. And what I would never be able to tell is how low that would be if they had no intervention. So there's just limits to how you can collect and analyze data in K-12. This is one of those. I do think that there could be some separation. I know Claire's taking copious notes about this and is happy and willing to adjust this in any ways that make sense for public dashboards and the information that we need. And I do think you're going to go in a little bit depth on some of the intervention stuff. That's going to be also super helpful and provide context as well. So if it's okay, we could.
Just one more thing, a little bit to Alex and Jorge's points. The dashboards are, I think, for me, or the displaying of the data is most informative and consequential for me when we're talking about something specific. So when we're checking in on the UIP and our UIP says we have X amount of growth, our goal is X amount of growth for folks that are receiving intervention and X amount of growth for those that are not. I mean, that's clearly articulated in our UIP. So we're checking in on our UIP, then I want to look at this data and say, great, how are we meeting that goal or not? And if not, why, or how, kind of asking those questions. But on a day-to-day dashboard, it might be a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, like, for me, the next logical question is, it's great to see all this data at once. And then when we get to sort of more of our regular rhythm and checkpoints, like, some of this becomes more important at different times as we're checking in on different aspects of our strategic plan and our UIP and all of our goals.
So here's the rhythm that we've established, and I appreciate you in this idea of rhythm and looking at data, right? In August, we have a set of data, right? In October, we're going to have a subsets of data that we could do some comparisons to, and those could be like annual reporting. Like in August, you're going to see what we've got, in October, you're going to see the subgroups and everything broken out. And then as we go on to the spring, it could be more about really dialed in on, how is the leading indicators based on our UIP strategic plan goals, if that's the rhythm, because we won't have new data or information. We'll have some mid-year data analysis and intervention potentially. And so let's get through this, but I do want to come back, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about this rhythm moving forward, or we could talk about it in prioritization, which is coming up in a few weeks.
That's it. One last point. I don't want to lose the fact that this graphic shows a tremendous improvement in an area, but it took me a long time to find it. And so I would totally be bragging about cutting in half the gap between intervened and not intervened in math. But I wouldn't know that until I'd spent like 15 minutes trying to understand it.
Great. Yeah, and I really appreciate this feedback too. And I'm like excited to go keep working on these as well. So one more just kind of drill down of the same view. So again, hearing your feedback about, clarity of what's the question here and maybe different ways to present it. But again, I'm proposing this for consideration for a board and public facing dashboard of these KPIs. So this is looking, just one more cut, looking by level, elementary, middle, high. Now, in this case, the top of the chart or the top of the page is looking at reading and writing growth. The bottom is now focused on math. Again, we have in each area 2 years of data stacked, and then our levels, elementary, middle, high. I think just the key things to point out here that I noticed, as with our overall student population, elementary trends a little bit higher than middle in growth. The math growth trended higher than reading and writing growth for those students who received that connected intervention in that content area. And then just a challenge point too is looking at those N numbers for high school are pretty low. Okay, so with that, I also wanted to share, this took us on a whole road of continuing some of the deeper dives that we do internally, and we wanted to share out some more information looking deeper at our reading intervention data, because that's an area where, as you saw, we have collected quite a bit of data, many students identified, and specific programs as well. So I have a few views specifically diving into that. So this first one, we are looking at different programs of elementary reading interventions delivered by an interventionist to students. We've got quality data about what is the program, the duration as well. So what we're looking at here, this is last school year's data, students who received the named intervention over a span of at least 90 days. And our metric here is the median percentile growth on iReady. So that's kind of iReady's version of like the CMAS growth that we look at. So a comparison to a national norm sample. We also wanted to look at iReady as a somewhat more proximal measure. So what I mean by that is that in these reading intervention, students are working on specific skills within reading. The iReady assessment is focused on reading skills. It's an adaptive assessment. And so it's somewhat closer than the CMAS standards-based summative to the skills that students are working on in those interventions. So with that, just pointing out here, the really great reading program and the BBSD virtual intervention program both stood out. Those both had high growth above the 65th percentile. And again, I'll just point out that none category, as Dr. Anderson was citing, like this is not a random controlled sample. That's a pretty diverse, large comparison group. And we just have to be cautious with what that is telling us.
Just a really quick question. Remind me again what the VIP folks are using as their intervention.
They are using really great reading. Yep.
Got it. Thank you.
Can you remind me what type of learners are still using LLI? Like who is that benefit? Is there a specific, because I look to like Wilson and Orton Gillingham and you kind of know what type of learners that those are targeting, but what is LLI? Can you remind me? There's very few students in that cohort.
Yeah, LLI stands for Leveled Literacy Intervention, and it is most commonly used with students who are reading on grade level in terms of the technical skills of reading, but need support with comprehension. And it is an intervention that we are phasing out, which is why you see so few students engaged in it.
Thanks. I was remembering that maybe we were phasing that out, and then it's still lingering, and so I wasn't sure. So thank you for clarifying, Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, just as a reminder, there is a day and time where that was the reading intervention, and BVSD was LLI, and we've expanded beyond that based on some of our academic return on investment work that we did early on 4 or 5 years ago. Also, remember a very expensive program called Reading Recovery, right? Was also a very heavy investment in the district, and we intentionally moved away from that because it was not meeting our needs. Not to say that it doesn't work within the right context. I want to be very careful. Anything within the right context could potentially work. It was not working for us within our context. And VIP, as a reminder, was a brilliant idea brought forward by a group of teachers post-pandemic who said, we can do this. We know how to do this. We actually really like doing this. Would you invest in this? And it has become a multi-year investment, and those teachers get better and better. Just a real success story on the teacher roundtable model. And when you listen to your folks, and they've got good ideas, and you lift those things up, they work.
So I have a question on the VIP and the really great reading. So you said the students getting the virtual intervention are using really great reading. So the green bar, does that represent students who are using really great reading but not virtually? Okay.
Okay, so just a few more looks here. The next chart, we're looking at the same programs. We're looking at elementary still. Our metric has changed a little bit. So another way we can look at this is the percentile gain. So at each testing point, students are receive a percentile of how they performed, again, relative to that national normed sample at that point in time. And so as students test throughout the year, we can take a difference in those percentile performances from beginning to end of year. So just a little bit different. It's not quite the same growth model type of look, but another metric that we always look at internally. And so here, I think a big takeaway is that we're seeing positive percentile gain across all of our interventions compared to that none kind of general population group.
So is that between beginning of the year and the middle of the year, or middle of the year and the end of the year? 'Cause right there are three standard test points for iReady.
Yeah, it's beginning to end of year.
Beginning to end. Okay, Alex.
Oops. I think this is super interesting. One is sort of a question, like how does a student end up in one of these categories? Is that what the MTSS process is doing and sorting within a school? Or does a school say, well, this is a Wilson Fluency school and this is an Orton Gilliam school? Like how do you end up in one or the other? And then are there characteristics based on how they might get sorted into one or the other that would also correlate with these gains and stuff?
So data is used as the starting point. So looking at student outcomes across dimensions of reading aligned with the science of teaching and learning reading. And then the intervention is chosen based on the student need that is most surfaced. Wilson, however, is an intervention for students with IEPs. And so it's not necessarily a Wilson school or not school. It's used in all of our schools for students with IEPs. We have many, many teachers from 4th grade on trained in really great reading. We have thousands of teachers trained in Orton Gillingham approaches. And so as teachers come together in the MTSS process, looking at how students are doing in particular areas of reading, then yes, determinations are made about what intervention will be delivered for students based on need.
Just a follow-up question again, just trying to understand this. So if I have two students and one ended up in really great reading and one ended up in Orton Gilliam or VIP, what would have been the difference between those students that led to them going in one place versus the other?
Well, for one thing, really great reading is more of an intermediate is an intermediate and secondary intervention. And so it is used primarily at our secondary schools, but also in 4th and 5th grade and also in the VIP program because the delivery online is very effective. It's a very effective program for online delivery. And Orton Gillingham is an approach that can be used from kindergarten on, and so is likely to be seen at the earlier grade levels, and will also be seen at older grade levels. However, is primarily our teachers who are trained in Orton Gillingham are elementary teachers. Very much focused on the foundations of reading, the reading components to become successful readers.
Okay, so we can extend this a little bit and look at the middle level. So again, using that same kind of metric of, sorry, I looked down, of achievement percentile gain, but now we're looking at our common lit assessment. So that again is one that's given 3 times per year. We're looking at a beginning of year to end of year difference in this case. And just a note about common lit as well, I mentioned how iReady as an assessment is a bit more proximal to the measures we're looking at here. Common Lit is a little bit in the middle. It is also a bit more standards-based versus skills-based compared to iReady, but it is given more, throughout the year and a little bit closer to the learning that's happening compared to the end of year or late in the year CMAS. So again, interesting patterns here. Also, interesting to note that none category is just a little below 0, probably within a margin of error. And so for the most part, we're seeing positive or about on par, with the exception of that Wilson fluency group. And again, knowing the nuance of which students are receiving the Wilson interventions. Okay, and then my just final piece here, we can extend that achievement percentile gain methodology circle back around to looking at CMAS. This is now looking at elementary and middle together in this view. And again, remembering that CMAS is a little bit more distant from the intervention itself. And so again, here we're just seeing some differences where some interventions we see students making greater spring to spring gains in this view versus students who aren't receiving any intervention.
I don't know how we would capture this, and maybe it would be a scatter plot with student growth percentiles and the percentile gain. But I've been educated by people that like a 2 percentile change from one year to another is a huge growth percentile correlation. So like, I think actually that 2 percentile gain for VIP is actually super impressive if you were to do it by median growth percentile. Because if you look at the 7,000 or so kids with none, they really, you expect kids to make no percentile gain from one year to the next in the big picture. That's sort of defining the average growth. So I think if there's some way to reflect that, I don't know how it might be.
I really appreciate this this analysis and this look. I'm thinking a little bit about how we would consider our student growth and achievement in math. We've gotten lots of information about reading, and I know it's easier to sort of quantify that with the information we have available, but would we be able to have comparable, similar slides, data for our students in math? Like if I'm trying to understand how BVSD or how my kid compares to other kids in BVSD in the area of math, what data would be available for my understanding?
Yeah, I think we're making big gains in terms of what we're offering and assessing in math. I think as you've heard this year, we, at middle level math, we have the NWA MAP testing, which as a data person is exciting. We're going to be getting some really good quality data from that. So I think we'll be able to catch up math a little bit more soon with some of these metrics.
Jason.
I know this is more of a data dive and discussion on presentation, but I'm curious to know, with this information here, is this affecting our practices? Are we looking at this data and saying, hey, clearly, or maybe not clearly, there's some interventions that are more effective? What do we do with this? What do you all take, or what's the takeaway from something like this?
Yeah, it's
If any.
absolutely affecting our practices and our decision-making moving forward. As I mentioned, LLI is something that we're phasing out. We're looking closely at, we have scaled out the VIP program already from 3 to 4 teachers. And so a massive scale out of the number of students served through that effective model. So yes, our team is continuously looking at not only this data, but other, like we've been working carefully with our partners at Read 180 and Math 180 around implementation of the intervention, including how many minutes students are spending on the intervention, what those intervention times look like for the delivery of Math 180, Read 180. In fact, we even changed our course offerings based on that kind of information so that we could get very clear on what is an intervention class at middle school and what is a reading class, for instance. So it's informing our infrastructure as well as our practices and decision-making about how we support and push support into teachers for use of and delivery of the materials, the curricular programs, and use of assessments.
And I'd also I would say that it's changing the way that we're able to engage with individual schools, and whether it's with our once a semester strategic support meetings, right, which we have with all of our schools, or with our deep dives that we're having at our cohort schools or with our UVA schools, around the idea that maybe it used to be, hey, what are you doing to intervene with these kids who aren't learning, to hey, here's the intervention you're using. Are you doing it with, are you implementing it with fidelity? And or is there one of these others that you might want to shift your program to, right? LLI, reading recovery. So system level, yes. And then I think the conversations we can have at the school level are much more meaningful as we're continuing to try to bring folks along school by school.
If I were to back up a little bit on the ease of interpretation and or the caveats we need, when I look back at slide 49, just to change topics really quickly, just go back a little bit if you can. That's the one. Let's see, that one. Yeah, I guess I would question maybe whether we should include the high schools in this, because the ends are so small. We're dealing with 0.5% of the kids. And they're going to just be so unstable from year to year. And so there's a lot that we can take from the elementary and middle. And then for the high schools, like my follow-up question is going to be, what is that program? Who are those 19 kids? So that may be really powerful stuff to do, but I think it sort of like draws the eye away from something that we have a lot of information about, to the thing we have the least information about. And I say, hey, what's the difference between middle and high school? And my conclusion would be totally different scale of program and probably totally different programming.
Well, I think, does that bring us to the end of your presentation on the data? And then that brings us back to sort of the overarching question that Dr. Anderson led with at today's work session, board members, is, so what, then what? And I don't know if Dr. Anderson, you want to lead us in that conversation.
Absolutely. I think that here's what I've heard board members say today, right? We've gotten some really good feedback on so a little bit more nuance on some of these looks. So when these data points come back to you, we can include some of that nuance. And I know that you've taken notes on that. I've heard really about this focus on the data that's most imperative to us now really aligns to how are we doing with the implementation with the UIP, right? And how is that aligned with both the district's goals, superintendent's goals, right, as a lens of focus. And so I think that, what I'm sensing is over the course of a year, it's almost like a funnel. You start out big, all of the data, you start to hone in, you really start to hone in.
And then by the end of the year, you should have a good sense of what you're planning for the following year, right? In regards to where things are working, where things are going. And if that feels like the right way for us to shape the presentations that we'll plan for in the spring, we can do some initial thinking. I can bring those ideas forward during prioritization. The idea that this district's never been more transparent than potentially today. That B, we're using the data to get better. That 3, we're already doing really good in comparison to other folks in a lot of really important, tough areas. And 4, that this board and this senior staff and this district is so focused on all together for all students that we'll continue to work harder than others, be more transparent than others, analyze deeper, continue to reflect on our practices to support the amazing people that we have. And so if that sounds like a good approach moving forward, I think that that's what I will have taken away from the session today.
Yeah, I think that sounds like an accurate summary, and I'm seeing nods from my board members, and that really does get to how are you using the data to improve student outcomes, and then how are we ensuring that that is happening, right? I mean, seeing all the granular data all the time isn't necessarily what we need to do. We just need to understand the action steps that you're taking, and the UIP is a great vehicle for that, as is the strategic plan. And so that sounds like the right way forward, and it's very similar to what our schools are doing with their DDI work, and just at all levels really adhering to kind of those looks for continuous improvement. Kitty.
Yes, thank you. And Rob, I'm really glad you asked that question at the beginning, because I've been thinking about this throughout the presentation. And given that different board members have different levels of interest in different things and, are interested in lots of detail in some and not others, I think about this in terms of, first of all, what does the board need in order to do our job? Because, our job is high level, our job is not, getting involved in the weeds. What would be interesting to the board, but not, 100% essential? And I'm not suggesting we only do the bare minimum in terms of educating the board. And then balancing that against staff time. I've always assumed, and I'm sure I'm correct, that you all staff have a lot more information in detail and get much more granular than you ever report to us. And that's good, because that's your job and that's your level of expertise. We need it to synthesize everything so that we can grow. And then layer on top of that how we present it to the public. Because, like Alex was asking a lot of detailed questions about all of the graphs. And I'm aware of information being reported in the media without proper context, and how that can really end up, not being a good thing. And a perfect example of that was when we first started doing testing statewide. It was a CCAP. And for years, it would be reported when the results came in that students in the partially sufficient, I can't remember if that was exactly what it was called, were below grade level, which was not true. Grade level was somewhere within that category, but that was not made clear to the public. So just an example of how this can be misinterpreted, and then that creates work for trying to explain it to the public.
Thank you, Kitty. And I will tell you that I find extreme value in all of this. I find extreme value in all of those categories, and being transparent, presenting information, and giving us the space to work as a team to press on all the corners of the district, right? To ask the questions, to bring the perspectives. I think as board members, you all bring assets and talents to this team, and I think our team grows from these sessions. And it's important, and it keeps us focused, right? It sharpens the saw in terms of making sure we're focusing on the right work. So, and I love the idea of what data is for what. And I think the great thing about this is we've created the bandwidth to build the system. So once we know what we want it to look like, I mean, the heavy lifting's happening now, right? Once we know what we want it to look like, right? You have a core set of looks, And then you'll always have a deeper dive as necessary. And that may look a little bit different depending on what group of students it might be, right? So today we did some deeper dives on emerging bilingual students and got into access data and got into levels and things of that nature, right? If we were looking at students with IEPs, it could be, what level of service, what models are they in? We can always work from the set of things that we know we're going to look at. And what I would hope for this board and for our public to know and understand is if we're not where we want to be, we're going to work until we get there. And we're going to be honest about it. And we're going to show that, and we're going to dig into it in all of the right ways. And so these sessions, I think that they've been incredibly productive for this board and hopefully you leave these sessions knowing a little bit more about the district, a little bit more about what we're doing, being able to ask questions in a good space. For us, in preparing and delivering and answering the tough questions, which is part of our job, it also helps to sharpen our focus and our efforts. And so just really am grateful and thankful for these new sessions that we've designed and have created together. And the value that our board brings and that our staff brings together. And for anybody who's been watching for 2 hours and 45 minutes, maybe they get something out of it as well.
I think last month, I think I used the word giddy to explain my reaction to the data that we were talking about and the depth of the analysis that we're able to have. And I do think it's incumbent on a board in 2024 with so many programs going on and so many values about making sure all kids can learn, to be able to have the ability to look close. So I think compared to the first days of testing, 1994 is when we established state tests and law in Colorado. To today, we have amazing tools and data at our disposal. And so much of what we're talking about for our school improvement strategies or in MTSS and DDI are about the application of that data. And just to put in perspective, I was fascinated by the presentation. I looked at it yesterday and had all these questions. I spent 2 hours with SchoolView, and I was able to generate about 20 views of my follow-up questions using the tool. So in terms of the staff analysis, I would comfort people with knowing that in 2024, having a follow-up question and looking at the data and saying, hey, what's it look like if I do this cut on the query? That takes about 30 seconds to generate. These are not going back and transforming a data set again, like it would have been 20 or 30 years ago, and then somebody needing to spend 6 weeks to come back for a new analysis. And Kitty, I can walk you through the tool and you can see the time it takes to ask these questions. So I don't feel bad about burdening staff when I say, hey, I have this follow-up question. What's this look like? Can we do this analysis? Those things literally take less than a minute to make the change to ask the follow-up question. So I think we should feel good about that. And then to the question of what is it for public consumption? Of course, that's a totally different thing for out of all the questions we could ask, we have to figure out what we want to share, how that helps and informs people. That's why I ask questions about what is the question this cut is supposed to answer? Because if we're trying to answer too many questions, it's hard to do, but it's easy to say this graphic is designed to address this question. And it's that matching, I think, that makes it make sense for the general public. So that as a data nerd, I just wanted to share, I think this is fantastic. I think the crew is doing wonderful work, and the commitment to transparency, it lets people see, I believe, the work that goes on in the schools in an MTSS system and a DDI approach and all that.
And I wasn't suggesting that there's anything we should not do. Was talking about things to consider. And I'm really glad that we have a tool that gives you all the information you want just like that. And I'd be interested in seeing it.
Just last thought, I think that, board members, when we set out with the vision for what these sessions would look like, we really were striving to be a model for others to learn from a governance team, from an engagement perspective, from an understanding perspective of what's happening in the district, to a transparency perspective, to a use perspective. And I feel like we're hitting the mark in an incredible way. And, hopefully, as this evolves and gets better over time, others can learn from the work that we're doing. So just thanks to everybody.
I want to echo that gratitude, Jonathan, Claire, Chris, Laura, and your team for helping guide us through this. And I think, what I'm hearing today is a lot of, using the data to get better, asking questions and kind of thinking a little bit more about data in different ways from different perspectives, and also relying on the expertise of our staff to say, well, yes, and maybe it's not really aligned, or yes, and we might understand something differently by looking at X instead of Y or Z, and sort of that relationship of the board using our capacity to ask those questions, and then the expertise also of the district to say whether or not that's aligned, and making sure we're really staying tracked on that vision. So it's like that push and pull of all of us working together to really do what's best for students and staff within our capacities. Board members, any last urgent questions for this team that has really done an outstanding job of really shifting how we're looking and thinking through data? Thank you guys so much. Dr. Anderson, I see you.
Just last thing, I think that the other thing that sets this apart is the teamwork between this Board of Education and our senior staff, right? Like, when I think about what's breaking in K-12 education across our country, in a lot of places it's that. A lot of places is as simple as, have we created the right spaces to think together, to partner together, to get into our governance roles, to get into our leadership roles, like break some of that down and just think and work together. Opportunities, I think, to present at NSBA or CASB around what this looks like would be something that I think that our team would be interested in if board members are interested in that. I don't know about those timelines or deadlines. But the power of being able to share things that are working with others to help bring them up as well, I think just increases the joy of being on a board and serving, and all the sacrifices that you make. And for us as career educators, making sure that we're trying to help each and every kid, even if they're not in BVSD.
I'm glad you said that, Rob. This kind of echoes back to some of the things we've been talking about. I do think we're doing really great work here. And I did look into the deadlines around an SBA and presenting. I think we should be sharing with folks about what good governance could look like, and ways that being intentional in your work moves the numbers, makes direct links to student outcomes. So we could still get in for NSBA. We're not able to get in with CASB at this point for a presentation, but I'm happy to lead that up or whatever. I think it'd be a really good thing to do.
Thank you, board members. Thank you, staff. With that, our meeting for today is adjourned.